All right, good morning. Today we're going to talk about the QPR three-step model to help suicide prevention. The QPR Institute is structured to make sure that we as gatekeepers ask a question to save a life. I know that this may not be an easy topic for us to talk about or share our stories, or this may trigger some emotional responses in some of you due to the fact that maybe one of you know of a loved one, a friend, family member, or even yourself that may be thinking about suicide. Today we're going to make some goals where we're going to raise awareness of suicide, dispel the myths and misconceptions while teaching you that three-step process to help save a life. QPR is about recognition and referral. It's not about treating suicidal people. Your job as a gatekeeper at the end of this training is to detect risk, not fix the problems that trigger thoughts of suicide. With that said, let's begin.
The world's largest organization for police says it's fighting a mental health crisis with an increasing number of suicides by officers. Nationwide, 188 have died by suicide so far this year. Now, that is twice the number of officers who have died in the line of duty. Think about that for a second. Yesterday, police chiefs from all around the country gathered in Chicago to address the crisis in a special forum for the very first time. Jeff Pegues has covered law enforcement extensively and moderated the discussion. Jeff, what did we learn?
Well, good morning. Police commissioners from around the country say removing the stigma of seeking help is the first step in combating this epidemic. We met with those inside, affected by suicide, and those outside of the department on the front lines of this fight.
He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, which he suffered with for 13 years.
At this year's International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference in Chicago, finding solutions for a disturbing trend in officer suicides was top of mind. Janice McCarthy understands the importance of speaking up. Her husband, Paul, a 21-year veteran of the Massachusetts State Police, took his own life in 2006. What needs to change?
The culture needs to change.
It's that culture, which she calls a fear by police officers against expressing their emotional and mental health, that may be contributing to the increased police suicide rate. She believes her husband's suicide was brought on by his mental and physical struggles after he was run over by a bus while on the job.
You'll be fine. Suck it up. It'll go away. It didn't go away. And the department didn't know what to do with that.
Earlier this year, President Trump authorized $7.5 million annually for the next 5 years for national police suicide prevention efforts, including mental health screening and more training.
Let's just all admit we're broken and join arms and let's talk about this stuff. Because we're not meant to do this by ourselves. We're not meant to suppress all this.
Detective Matt Thornton has been with the Zion Police Department in Illinois for 16 years.
It's very, very difficult.
Thornton admits to bottoming out from the demands of the job and planning to take his own life.
Crying and going over this plan, and I see a lady walking in a parking lot, and she's coming straight to my squad car. She knocks on my window, and she hands me this red cross. And she said, "You need this." And it was the most surreal moment of my life.
He says that moment changed his life and made him realize that he needed to reach out for help, something cops don't often do.
It needs to come to the forefront because I'm sick of it. I'm sick of crying because I can see the signs because I lived them.
Well, Thornton says that he has made it a point in his life to help fellow officers in need. Some departments do have trained mental health professionals on staff for support, but there doesn't appear to be a national standard for treatment or even the data to know what's really needed or available.
When talking about suicide, specifically, in 2019, we can see in the chart on the next slide how many suicides have been completed versus the inline duty deaths. So as we can see, there are a lot more numbers of suicide regarding police officers versus the in-line duty deaths. There's something to be said about that. QPR again stands for question, persuade, and refer.
It may be hard to imagine, but according to the World Health Organization, over 800,000 people die each year by suicide. That is more people than are killed in all the wars and homicides combined. Of these deaths each year, more than 40,000 are Americans. That is one death by suicide every 13 minutes. Suicide affects every region of the world and is the third highest cause of death for people aged 15 to 44. And for every life lost, another 25 people will attempt suicide, often causing serious medical injury or lifelong disability. Today, the greatest loss of life is among working-aged men, 35 to 65 years old. Men of all races and ethnicities are at higher risk. And from the very young to the very old, millions of Americans think seriously about suicide for days, weeks, and even years. Thinking seriously about suicide is itself a kind of misery index, a sign that something is terribly wrong and needs attention. Most often, what needs attention and treatment is clinical depression, a medical condition that is now the leading cause of disability in the world. In America alone, there are an estimated 15 million sufferers. Most of us are touched by suicide. Some of us have lost family members, loved ones, friends, schoolmates, or colleagues. None of us escapes the loss of people we admire and respect, whether they are people we know or are much-loved musicians, artists, and entertainers. If you have lost someone close to you to suicide, then you already know the considerable cost, the tears and awful pain of loss. And if you are one of the millions who have thought seriously about suicide, then you already know just how lonely and terrible it is to suffer alone. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar, and thought disorders like schizophrenia all contribute great risk for suicidality. Yet most people suffering from a mental illness do not kill themselves. They get help, they find a way, and they recover to live full and productive lives. And if recovery is possible, that means suicide is preventable. Thankfully, the world is changing. We understand mental illness. We understand suicide. And we know that treatment saves lives. Right now, our teachers don't teach us about depression and suicide. And our faith leaders often struggle to talk openly about these topics. Too often, doctors can't talk to their patients about suicide, even patients who are sitting in their offices planning how to end their lives, perhaps by overdosing on the medication being prescribed to them. The world remains dangerously ignorant about suicide. So to save lives, we must bring this subject out of the shadows. Effective treatment would save thousands of lives around the world. But we must learn to talk comfortably about suicide, and we need your help to start the conversation. Join us in this fight, a fight to save lives. Preventing suicide, it's what people do.
Alright, let's talk about this bridge that you see in front of you. Let's just take a minute and see if any of you guys know what bridge this is and what the significance of this bridge is while learning about suicide. If many of you don't know, this is the Golden Gate Bridge. It's a 1 mile wide straight connecting bridge in the San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. It's located in San Francisco, California. Now, most people drive to this bridge to admire its beauty, its architecture, and the significance of how popular it has become over the years. On the other hand, there's other reasons for why people visit this bridge. not for its beauty or architectural structure, or a photo. The Golden Gate Bridge is the most used suicide site in the world. The deck is about 245 feet above the water, and after a fall of 4 seconds, jumpers hit the water at around 75 miles per hour. Most die from the impact or the trauma sustained from the fall. About 5% survive the initial impact, but generally drown or die of hypothermia in the cold water. As we see on the next slide, you would think that with the statistics of how many people are committing suicide or die by suicide on this bridge, you would think that there was more of a direct way to stop the suicide from happening. Instead, you see at the bridge crisis counseling, where it says there is hope, make the call. Then it says indirectly, the consequences of jumping from this bridge are fatal and tragic. I believe at this point that there should be something a little bit more direct that says, if you are thinking about suicide, please call 911 or a suicide hotline. Seek help. Talk to somebody. Who is Kevin Hines? Kevin Hines, born John Kevin Hines, was born on August 30th of 1981. I'd like to take this time for you guys to watch this video about Kevin Hines and reflect on his decision.
We have lost far too many lives traveling the path to this day. Since 1937, over 2,000 people have died at the Golden Gate Bridge. I feel lucky to be alive every single day. Of the thousands that have died off the Golden Gate Bridge, I am of the 1% who have survived. So I was born on drugs and premature. And then I bounced around from home to home. Nobody wanted to keep me because I was sick. And I got lucky. I landed in the home of Patrick and Deborah Hines. I had a great childhood. I thought, growing up, that everything's going to be great. And then at 17, it all came crashing down. If you can imagine feeling that everyone around you is out to get you, trying to hurt you, and trying to kill you, and you believe that to be the truth. From the extreme paranoia, I exhibited symptoms of mania. From the mania came the hallucinations, both auditory and visual. And so with that and the bipolar disorder, I just was spiraling out of control. I vividly remember writing my suicide note. People don't get it. Like, I thought I was a burden to everyone who loved me, because that's what my brain told me, because that's how powerful your brain is. I got off the bus. I walked slowly down the walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge. People rode by me, drove by me, walked by me, and a woman approached me, and she said, "Will you take my picture?" She said thanks, and she walked away. It was that moment I just said, nobody cares. The reality was that everybody cared. I just couldn't see it. I ran forward, and using my two hands, I catapulted myself into free fall. What I'm about to say is the exact same thing that 19 Golden Gate Bridge jump survivors have also said. The millisecond my hands left the rail, it was an instant regret. And I remember thinking, no one's going to know that I didn't want to die. In 4 seconds, I fell 75 miles an hour, 25 stories, and I hit the water. I was in the most physical pain I had ever experienced. I have ever experienced. The Coast Guard was amazing. He was just so freaked out that I was alive that he just dove in and brought me on board. The guy said, "Do you know how many people we pull out of this water that are already dead?" And I said, "No, and I don't want to know." The guy put his hand on my forehead and said, "Kid, you're a miracle." My father took one step into the hospital room, and I looked up at him and I said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And he said, "No, Kevin, I'm sorry." And if you think about it, both of our immediate reactions were guilt. Guilt that didn't belong to either of us. And even though I didn't die, I caused people a great deal of grief and pain. Just the day of my attempt still sits within them today. I asked my father if he still feared my death by suicide. He said every time the phone goes off, his first inclination is Kevin alive. I had that impact on my dad. So after the jump, the road to recovery was pretty long. I had 7 psych ward stays in the next 11 years. I still have all the symptoms I ever had. Mania, depression, psychosis, hallucinations, all that's still there. I just know how to cope with it and I know how to beat it. I built a support network over these years of treatment so that I wouldn't be fighting this alone. So it's okay not to be okay. It's not okay not to ask for someone to back you up. To the families who live with the loss or losses of loved ones, they didn't do that to hurt you or destroy your life. They took their lives because they were struggling and in a great deal of emotional and mental pain. Suicide, mental illness, and addiction are the only diseases that we blame the person for perpetually. But people die from suicide just like they die from any other organ diseased. Today, no matter the pain I'm in, no matter the struggles I experience, I do believe that life is the greatest gift we've ever been given. And if you're suffering mentally, don't wait like I did sitting in denial for so long. Because recovery happens. I'm living proof.
So Kevin Hines' story is pretty impactful. And like he said, he is one of the few who have survived a suicide attempt. Couple things that Kevin said that kind of stick with me and maybe stick with you is the thought that nobody cared. Now, he wouldn't have known if anybody cared if he did die by suicide. But what he actually found out was everybody cared. The other thing, too, I think about is with Kevin is once he jumped off that bridge, he stated he had immediate regret and that no one was going to know that he didn't want to die. But he was given that chance to tell people that he was sorry and that he needed help. Kevin also said it's okay not to be okay, which is true. There's things that, we in law enforcement come across, and, the stigma is that we're all that tough, strong, hard outer exterior, and that it's our job to see the things that we see, go to the calls that we go to, and that we're all supposed to just continue wearing the uniform and go to the next call for service. But keep in mind, and I'm a big advocate of this, is that it's okay not to be okay. It's just not okay to not look for backup in life and get the resources that you need to get you through whatever it is that you're going through. Statistics show that there's about 47,000 deaths annually attributed to suicide. Back in 2009, there were only about 36,000. And data shows for 2017 that we have already increased to about 47,000. What is that to say about what is happening to people in society? Are our resources working? Are we able to identify who is suicidal? Do we know what to do once we find out that somebody may be contemplating suicide? For every 11 minutes, there is one suicide, or 129 suicides every day. In 2017, 6,252 people between the ages of 15 to 24 died by suicide each year. That's at a rate of one suicide every 2 hours. So if you think about that with your work day, you have 8 hours in a work day. How many people is that committed suicide in your 8-hour work day? That's 4. Let's hope I'm doing the math right. That is 4 people a day in your 5-day work week. That's 20 people in a week that die by suicide. What is it that we can do to help stop this and save a life? Suicide is the leading cause of death, and here are some statistics that show what other causes of death rank the highest. So if we see on the chart here, suicide, which is intentional self-harm, is number 10. It's in the top 10 for death, whereas diseases of the heart ranks number 1. There's something to be said about that. It's intentional. The other items on the list aren't intentional. They're just ailments of the body. But suicide is number 10. Here we can see the national ranking and rate of suicide in 2017 shows that Connecticut is number 44 on the list, ranking at 11.3%, and Montana ranking number 1 at 29.6%. USA total rate of 13.9% of suicides. If we take a look here at the Connecticut data from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, I'll have you click that link, take you to another page. We can look for state fact sheets. So if we scroll all the way down, we're going to go to Connecticut. And if we click on Connecticut, it shows that in 2020, on average, 1 person died by suicide every 21 hours in this state. It is the 11th leading cause of death in Connecticut, with the 2nd leading cause of death from ages 10 to 34, 4th leading cause of death for ages 35 to 54, 7th leading cause of death for ages 55 to 64, and the 17th leading cause of death for ages 65 and up. So again, Connecticut is state rank number 45, has about 419 deaths by suicide, and at a rate per 100,000 population. Suicide costs in Connecticut total over $410 billion combined with a lifetime medical and work loss cost. The total deaths to suicide reflected a total of 6,798 years of potential life lost before the age of 65. And then it shows that there's more than 3 times as many people who died by suicide in Connecticut in 2018 than in alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents. If you go back, you can see the other states that show, what rank they are. Where we are the 11th, and let's just take a look, let's say, at Florida. Florida is the 8th leading cause of death. Keep going, scrolling down, we have Idaho, that's the 7th leading cause of death. And so forth. So it's interesting in determining why, one part of the state has a bigger suicide rate versus another. So then on the next slide, if you go and click on the Yukon map of teen suicides, You can see in the map each region, and in the bottom right hand corner it's color coded. So if you can see, black is not included, white is average as expected, which you could see a lot of spots on this Connecticut map are showing in white. Then we have low, better than expected, which is in light blue. We have a couple low as expected in a lighter blue, and then we have a high in orange and worse in red. So we don't really have any reds, but high as expected is East Windsor, Granby, Stafford, and we are actually high in Manchester, Vernon, and Tolland. Which is probably why we get so many calls for service in our town, because statistics are showing that we are on the higher end versus any other part of the state. So what's the impact of suicide? 115 people are exposed. Let's say 53 have a short-term disruption in life, 25 have a major life disruption, and 11 have a devastating effect on their life due to that suicide attempt. Impacts especially severe in small, tight-knit communities. When somebody attempts suicide, it does not just affect them. It affects surrounding individuals, communities, and families. So, who is impacted and exposed to suicide? Suicide risk is greater in survivors, and it increases drastically when a parent dies by suicide for that child. If roughly 47,000 Americans die by suicide each year, over 1 million people suffer devastating effects on their life and or suffer a major life disruption. We can ask the question, how many have died by suicide since 9/11? And how many new survivors are there? The ratio of 11 people experiencing devastating effects per suicide means there are 11 new people experiencing devastation every 11 minutes, or 1,419 every day. So now let's get into what QPR is.
Research shows that the odds of surviving a heart attack in a public place are 10 times greater in regions where thousands of ordinary citizens are trained in CPR. It's called bystander rescue. When someone shows signs of experiencing cardiac arrest, the response of nearby friends, family, or coworkers is critical. The effective use of CPR doubles or triples one's chances of surviving a heart attack. Like CPR, QPR is an emergency intervention for someone experiencing a life-threatening crisis. QPR is easy to learn and easy to remember, but it takes courage to overcome our fears about reaching out to help someone who may be considering suicide. Research also shows that where QPR is widely taught, suicide attempts and deaths decrease. Just like CPR, QPR requires quick, bold, and informed action. Because suicide, like heart attacks, remains a rare event, we must train hundreds to save one, thousands to save hundreds, and millions to save thousands. There is an old Welsh saying, "No great misery goes unspoken." When we have a toothache, we tell people. We don't hide our pain. But because of the stigma and taboo around the word suicide, many people considering suicide don't speak plainly about their suffering. They fear our rejection. They fear that if they say something, we will ridicule them or make fun of them. As a result, people thinking about suicide often use indirect language. They hint at what they're thinking of doing. They send us coded messages, and they suffer in silence. Called suicide warning signs, QPR training teaches you how to recognize these warning signs, quickly decode them, and then question the person in an informed and compassionate manner to learn if they are considering suicide. Just as talking about physical pain helps diminish it, Talking about suicide with someone willing and able to listen reduces psychological pain almost immediately. Trained QPR gatekeepers are merchants of hope, and hope helps prevent suicide. Millions of people have now been trained in QPR. Rigorous independent research studies support QPR as effective, and thousands of personal stories assure us that QPR is saving lives. When you use QPR, not everyone will be suicidal. Some people are simply stressed to the breaking point, but they still need help. Help you can give. Please note that you cannot put the idea of suicide into someone's mind. People are either thinking about suicide or they're not. The fear of putting the idea of suicide into someone's head is a myth that keeps us from acting when we should do just the opposite. QPR is a universal intervention for people in pain, whether they're thinking about suicide or not. While it takes a special courage to overcome our fears, we will teach you how to ask about suicide and to offer hope through listening. Listening is the power tool that restores hope in the hopeless. We know you can do this, and we will show you how. Preventing suicide. It's what people do.
So a couple things about that video about what QPR is. They like to use QPR as a short couple letters in comparison to CPR. They talk about how experiencing cardiac arrest and having somebody provide nearby response is critical in the survival of a heart attack. Is that the same to be said about QPR, where we're trying to use this standard as an emergency intervention for somebody experiencing a life-threatening crisis? So we want to make sure we question, persuade, and refer the person when there's a thought of suicide. How many of you think you guys have what it takes to reach out to somebody who's thinking about suicide? Do we have to overcome our fears about reaching out? It's learned that we cannot put the idea of suicide into somebody's head, and that it is a myth that if we talk about suicide, we are going to make that person want to attempt to commit suicide. But over the years, we have learned that that is actually not true. So what should we do with the information that we're given? We should try to talk to that person, be that hope for that person. But sometimes it's not that easy because we fear rejection, or they may fear rejection, on both parts. If we find somebody that we either work with or somebody in society we come across, are we afraid that they're going to just turn us down and say everything is fine? Or are we worried about them actually saying, yes, I want to commit suicide, or I want to die by suicide, and we don't have the tools to actually help them? So what do we look for when somebody might be in crisis? Indirect clues. Did they change drastically in their behavior from really quiet to really outgoing, or vice versa? At this point, we now know that QPR creates gatekeepers, which is all of you, and that QPR is effective, and it assures us that QPR is helping save lives. Keep in mind that when you use QPR, not everybody is going to be suicidal. Some people are going to be stressed to the breaking point, and that they may need help. Just to reiterate, QPR is not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment. It is intended to offer hope through positive action. So let's go over some suicide myths and facts. So myth: no one can stop a suicide, it's inevitable. Fact: if people in a crisis get the help they need, they will probably never be suicidal again. Myth: confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. Fact: asking someone directly about suicide intent lowers anxiety, opens up communication, and lowers the risk of an impulsive act. Myth: only experts can prevent suicide. Fact: suicide prevention is everybody's business and anyone can help prevent the tragedy of a suicide. Myth: suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. Not necessarily. Fact: most suicidal people communicate their intent sometime during the week of preceding their attempt. Myth: those who talk about suicide don't do it. Fact: people who talk about suicide may try or even complete an act of self-destruction. Myth: once a person decides to complete suicide, there is nothing more anyone can do to stop them. Fact: suicide is the most preventable kind of death, and almost any positive action may save a life. So that goes into how can I help? Well, we'll start with the first of the QPR, which is Q. We want to ask the question. Now that brings me to identifying us as first responders to calls for service, where there's an emotionally disturbed person or somebody battling a crisis. I find that it is easier in our role as law enforcement to ask that question. On scene, we're direct. Are you suicidal? Are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan? Now, why is it that it's easier to ask people we do not know versus asking, let's say, a coworker that we see a change in, or a family member who we see a change in? Is there a reason why we have a harder time asking the question, or do we not have a hard time asking the question at all? That's something that you need to decide for yourself. So, suicide clues and warning signs. The more clues and signs observed, the greater the risk. So we should all take signs seriously. Now, I know you guys are really good at suicide direct and indirect verbal clues. Direct verbal clues are, I've decided to kill myself, I wish I were dead, and so forth. I know it's really easy to write on our committal forms the direct verbal clues. I find that we struggle with the indirect verbal clues because it's easier for somebody to do an indirect verbal clue and not have the same repercussions of, let's say, going to the hospital or having to talk to a crisis worker or something like that. So some indirect verbal clues are, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on. People say that, but can they change it if you were to ask the question and say, oh, I'm just tired today, or I just can't go on with my schedule for today. What does their indirect verbal clue actually mean? Or, my family would be better off without me. I know I've responded to calls for service where people say on scene, my family would be better off without me in regards to payment or bills, but they retract the suicidal statement. That still should be an indirect verbal clue that maybe they are contemplating or thinking about suicide. And that's where we have to ask that question. So some behavioral clues we should be looking for: any previous suicide attempts, acquiring a gun, or let's say stockpiling pills in their home. Do they have co-occurring depression, moodiness, or hopelessness? Do we see people putting personal affairs in order, giving away prized possessions, have a sudden interest or disinterest in religion? Is there any type of drug or alcohol abuse or relapse after a period of recovery, or any unexplained anger, aggression, or irritability? Other factors that may want somebody to attempt a suicide. Let's say being fired or being expelled from school. For us, that would be an internal investigation or some repercussions to a decision we made while working. We all know the stresses of law enforcement today are really high, and that sometimes, or maybe somebody here is almost at the breaking point where they can't handle the stress anymore. Is there a loss of any major relationship? Death of a spouse, child, best friend, especially if by suicide, but not always. Is there a diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness? Is there sudden unexpected loss of freedom or fear of punishment? Financial issues? Would they lose a therapist, a teacher, a counselor, a coworker? Or is the person, getting older in age or disabled in some way, and their fear of becoming a burden to others? So how do we ask the question when it's someone we either know and it's really personal to us, and we can't seem to ask the question as easy as we are while we're working? So if in doubt, don't wait, just ask the question. If the person is reluctant, be persistent. Talk to the person alone in a private setting. Allow the person to talk freely, and give yourself plenty of time. This is a topic that many people don't want to either admit or talk about, but if it's just in passing and saying, oh, hey, how you doing? You feeling okay today? And you don't give that person time to open up, you might be missing it. You also should have resources handy. At the end of this class, you'll get a QPR card that will have phone numbers, counselor information, and any other information that might help the person you're helping. There will also be a list of other resources at the end of this. So remember, how you ask the question is less important than how you ask it. So next, some tips on how to ask the question of suicide in a less direct approach. So, have you been unhappy lately? Have you been very unhappy lately? Have you been so very unhappy lately that you've been thinking about ending your life? Or do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? Maybe starting with a less direct approach can assist you in getting the question answered. Maybe the direct approach isn't going to work for that certain individual. Or we can do the direct approach and say, when people are upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way too. Or, you look pretty miserable. I wonder if you're thinking about suicide. Or, just go straight to it. Are you thinking about killing yourself? If you cannot ask the question, find somebody who can. So now let's go into how not to ask the suicide question. You're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Suicide is a dumb idea. Surely you're not thinking about suicide. So now that we have the question down, how are we going to persuade someone to stay alive? First, let's listen to the problem and give them your full attention. Asking somebody in passing if they're contemplating suicide, or let's say if we're talking about officers, co-officers we work with, sitting car to car with somebody where they potentially could go to a call for service, I don't know if that's, the most appropriate time. But remember, suicide is not the problem, only the solution to a perceived insoluble problem. Now that's really important, because we have to remember that suicide is not the problem. There is a reason for why this person wants to commit suicide or wants to die by suicide, because that's the only way to get rid of an insoluble problem. So we need to figure out what is the real problem behind this person's decision to want to end their life. What is the problem? We also do not want to rush to judgment. We don't want to say, oh yeah, your problem and the reason for why you want to, end your life by suicide is it's stupid or something like that. It's not up to you to decide if it's a good reason or not. And you want to offer hope in any form. So then you want to ask them, will you go with me to get help? Will you let me help you help? Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we've found some help? Now, that is a little tough because us being in law enforcement, and as a new gatekeeper once this training is over, you as a law enforcement officer have the responsibility to protect that person and get them help, because you don't want the burden on you if there was something that you didn't do or you didn't find them resources and they did commit suicide. So making that promise not to kill yourself until you found help may not work for us specifically because we are law enforcement. However, your willingness to listen and to help can rekindle hope and make all the difference. Now, was there ever a time that you had a bad day or something wasn't going right in your life? And it's not that you were thinking about suicide, or maybe you have, only you inside of you would know that. But did you get any sense of relief when you spoke to somebody that you're close with at work, or you spoke to your spouse, or you spoke to somebody? Did you feel any relief? That sometimes can rekindle hope and make all the difference. Now we're on to R for refer. Suicidal people often believe they cannot be helped, so you may have to do a little bit more. The best referral involves taking the person directly to someone who can help. Maybe they need somebody who knows specifically what they're going through. Maybe if we're talking about us in law enforcement, it's talking to another law enforcement officer who has contemplated suicide, has gotten help, and is now returned to a stable level of thinking. The third best referral is to give referral information and try to get a good faith commitment not to complete or attempt suicide. Any willingness to accept help at some time, even in the future, is a good outcome. Remember, since almost all efforts to persuade someone to live instead of attempt suicide will be met with agreement and relief, don't hesitate to get involved or take the lead. So for effective QPR, question, persuade, refer, say to this person, I want you to live, or I'm on your side. We will get through this. Get others involved. Ask the person who else they might need help from. Would it be beneficial for you to be their advocate and speak to family, friends, their brothers or sisters, a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, a bishop, a physician? Or add to the list another law enforcement officer who's going through this, or another person who has a terminal illness and knows what you're going through. Remember, with the statistics that were told to you earlier this morning, there are many people going through this. This isn't something that no one else is going through and that nobody else can relate. That just isn't true. But when that person is in crisis, they might not be thinking of all those things, even if they're one of these people who's taking this class right now. You might have to be that person to remind them that there is hope, there is help, and you're going to follow through to get them to that help. So for effective QPR, join a team. Offer to work with clergy, therapists, psychiatrists, or whoever else is going to provide counseling or treatment. It is extremely important to follow up with a visit, a phone call, or a card, and in whatever way feels comfortable to you. Text message, there's a bunch of ways. Let the person know you care about what happens to them. Caring may save a life. Some other information I'd like to share is for emergency responders. Did you know 1 person dies every 90 minutes from a fire? There are over 1 million firefighters in the United States, and 75% of those are volunteers. 104 firefighters died in service to their communities in 1994, and another 95,000 suffered injuries. There are approximately 700,000 sworn law enforcement officers in the United States. Of those officers, 160 of them died in the line of duty in 1997. And that more than 65,000 law enforcement officers are assaulted annually, and 23,000 are wounded. With all this information, suicide is the leading cause of death in active law enforcement officers. This is over 3 times the rate of homicides. Police officers have suicide rates that are as much as 3 to 4 times higher than the general population. Suicide is the leading cause of death in active law enforcement officers, which is over 3 times the rate of homicides, which was already said, but it's good to hear it again. Suicide rates among officers doubled between the years of 1950 and 1990. And 300 police officers completed suicide in 1994, and that's double the rate killed in the line of duty. Firearms are the most common method of law enforcement suicide, and they generally occur at home away from the workplace, but not always. Over 80% of those police officers who committed suicide had communicated their intent to others, whether it was an indirect or direct statement. Did people listen to that officer? Did they start the process of questioning, persuading them, and referring them? Over 25% of police officers abuse or are dependent upon alcohol. Additional risk considerations are psychological stress from the job, what we see on a daily basis. Some people believe, that the psychological stress is normal. It's a part of the job. You have to deal with it. The suck it up mentality. Who's to say at one point or that one certain call is going to be the breaking point for that officer? Now, I'm not naive to say that I don't agree that there are certain things about this job that say, yes, we need to, stand strong and tall and say, yes, this is a part of our job. We are going to see these things. But who is there to listen, to check on us, to make sure that we are okay? It starts with you. It starts with you checking in on your fellow officers, to make hope, to be hope for them. Other risk considerations are firearm availability. We all carry one every day, maybe to and from work. Maybe we don't go anywhere without one. We have repeated exposure to trauma. That brings me back to maybe this past call that I went on is my breaking point. But to everybody else, it was just a normal routine call for service. But to me, it's my breaking point. We have job-related stress. I don't even think I need to touch base on that at this point with the climate now in 2020, but that's at an all-time high right now. Maybe we have relationship difficulties, not even just with, our lives out of work, maybe with our relationships at work. Maybe there's a supervisor that's, excuse my French, on our asses, and, we're just like, God, I just need a break today. Or, your coworkers, breaking your stones left and right, and you're just like, God, I need a break. Maybe there's financial problems. Or maybe there's that difficulty of transitioning into retirement. All of those things play a huge factor with law enforcement suicide. Now, this final slide, or actually the last couple slides, there's a reason why I'm so passionate about teaching, fellow officers about QPR. Officer Tommy Byrne of the Naugatuck Police Department died by suicide on November 3rd of 2017. In the photos here, you can see that he was a husband, he had a wife, he has a son, he He was a friend and co-worker of my husband, and many others. He was in the military. You know, he was a veteran, and something happened in his personal life that he just couldn't take. I don't know if any of you guys know him or ever heard of him, of Tommy, but he decided that the stress of losing his wife, everything he ever worked for, his house, you know, everything that everybody between you and I worked so hard for to make a great family environment was going to be lost because his personal relationship at home wasn't working. Now, I can't get too much into detail with that because, you know, I knew Tommy, but I didn't know too much about his personal life. But there were some key factors that, and signs, if you will, that Tommy did that even other officers at his police department didn't really notice or didn't really think that his I need to do this over. Let's change this. Jesus. This next slide is important to me because it is a friend and a co-worker of my husband's. It's somebody that I knew who died by suicide on November 3rd of 2017. So Officer Tommy Burns of the Naugatuck Police Department decided to die by suicide in November. As you can see in the photos, he was a veteran. He was a police officer at the Naugatuck Police Department. He was a brother. He was a husband. He was a friend, and he was a dad. He worked really hard, working overtime, pulling long hours at the police department, building a great foundation for his family. He had a beautiful house, had all those, you know, guy toys, if you will, nice cars, you know, fancy tools, you know, those types of things that we all work hard for. However, Tommy was in crisis, and he didn't know what to do because his marriage was deteriorating. Now, I don't really want to get too much into his personal life because, like I said, I knew Tommy, but I didn't know much about his personal life. But from what I do understand is that he was going to lose everything. The dual income, the house that he worked so hard for. He didn't know what to do. He was going to work where he kind of would keep his head down. He offered, you know, a couple of his like lawnmowers, riding mowers, boat, other highly expensive things that he worked really hard for to coworkers, and everyone just thought, you know, he was downsizing. You know, like, oh, hey, he's trying to save money here, save money there. No one really thought anything of it. My husband, who also worked with Tommy, said that he would come into work. He had a lot of, you know, let's say divorce papers. He would go into the police department, make copies of the papers, and then he would just leave. He was quiet, kept to himself, and that wasn't like him. On November 3rd, 2017, he decided to take his work firearm, and die by suicide in his house. I like to share this story because it proves that you may think you know somebody's intentions, you may think that there's nothing wrong, but what if somebody reached out? Not to say nobody did. I don't know that. But we are not sheltered from having this happen to us. So with that said, I ask you all to take the tools that you learned today and apply them to your fellow officers. Check in on them. Ask the question. Refer them, whether they're going to be upset with you or not. Make a plan and be that hope for them. Because I know that at the end of the day, I don't want to be that person that didn't ask the question to let them see another day. Remember, when you apply QPR, you plant the seeds of hope. And and hope helps prevent suicide. And remember, it's okay to not be okay. Help is available, and you do matter.